For this video, we're going to be talking about natural selection. And I just came across a perfect example of natural selection, this little shovel-nosed snake here. So this is a snake that likes to live inside dune habitats, which I'm outside right now, walking around a dune. It's the middle of the night. I think it's a little bit after midnight. I'm out here working on a research project, and I thought this would be a perfect example to describe natural selection. So, if you recall from the previous videos, natural selection is a mechanism of evolution that produces adaptations. So it's non-random selection, unlike genetic drift, which is random. So for natural selection to happen, for non-random changes in basically allele frequency to occur, you need three basic things. You need one, variations. So you need variations within the traits of the organism. In this little shovel-nosed snake here, you can see it there. He has these bright colors, these bands, or we call them saddles, which are red and black. Can you move the light a little bit? See, there we go. So he has these different colorations here, and those patterns will vary from snake to snake. You also get differences in length and size of the snake, differences in behavior, and most importantly for this guy, the reason why he's called the shovel-nosed snake is his nose is shaped like a cone or like a little shovel, so he can dig through the sand. You can kind of see that V shape right here. So within shovel-nosed snakes, there's a lot of variability. Now, the next piece of it is that variability needs to be heritable. So heritable means it needs to be passed on to the offspring. The way that happens is through genetics. So we have proteins encoded by genes. Those proteins and various other traits that arise from those genes get passed on from parent to offspring. Now we know most of the traits of this little shovel-nosed snake here are genetic. They will be passed on. They will be inherited by the offspring of this individual. And then the third component then is selection. So we have variability amongst shovel-nosed snakes. We know that trait is heritable, and so now we need selection. Selection is an increased or decreased chance of survival or reproduction. So if this guy was to, say, have a trait that made it more likely to be eaten by a predator, he would be being selected against. And the same would be true the other way. If he had a trait that made it more likely that he would avoid a predator, would make him selected for. His traits would be more likely to be passed on. Now, when we're talking about survival, that's really a proxy for reproduction. Because in order for his traits to be passed on at all, they have to reproduce. And for them to when they reproduce, they'll pass on their traits. And so we're mostly talking about the number of offspring that an individual can have. The longer you live, though, the more offspring that you will then most likely have. And so whether or not the individuals have more or less offspring is a major determinant in whether or not they're being selected for or against by the environment. Now there's a lot of little adaptations that this guy has, which is why I wanted to use him as an example. One, I'm on a sand dune, like I said, and sand is really soft. And a lot of animals in the desert on these sand dunes like to hide in the sand during the day or to evade predators. And I'll show you this maybe at the end of the video. This shovel nose that he has here, he'll dive into the sand and he'll swim through it. And sometimes they'll avoid you by getting into that sand really quickly. So that's a major adaptation. That allows it to avoid predators and also the heat of the day because they can hide down in the sand dune. Now, the coloration on this snake, something we'll talk about later, this banded coloration, is what is called a Batesian mimic, or the snake is a Batesian mimic. That color is a warning to predators saying, hey, get away, I'm really toxic, if you eat me you might die. Now this snake's not dangerous. You could eat it and you would not die. He's not toxic at all. But there's another snake around here called a coral snake, which is highly venomous and is very dangerous to us and other animals. And so a lot of snakes in this area adopt this coloration because they're mimicking the coral snake. So one of the adaptations that this snake has is having this coloration that allows it to avoid predators because it's mimicking another animal, which is really cool. So this guy's a perfect case study for natural selection. Now, within natural selection, there's a subcategory of natural selection called sexual selection. Sexual selection is just a very specific type of natural selection. It requires the same things. It requires variation, inheritance, and selection. But instead of selection just being absolutely anything that is having an impact on survival or reproduction, sexual reproduction is particularly a selective pressure being imposed by the opposite sex. So a good example of this is peacocks. You've seen male peacocks with those big trains out there. Those trains are used by females to select males of high quality. You can imagine being a peacock running around with that big tail. That big tail is a huge hindrance to them. They can more likely get caught by predators because they have this giant basically a parachute behind them. So if you can survive with a parachute, you're probably a pretty strong individual, and females can then use that as a proxy to select a good mate. So in that case, the selective pressure is being imposed on the males by the females. That's sexual selection. Another good example of this is the Irish elk. The Irish elk is now extinct, but they used to have huge antlers. And that was because the females selected males with ginormous antlers. They wanted the mate with the largest antlers possible. That was then ended up being bad when the planet started to warm after the last ice age, and the forest started to get really forested, and the antlers couldn't move to the forest, and they died out. But those two are good examples of sexual selection, which is just a special type of natural selection. Okay, so I'll go ahead and let this guy go, and hopefully he'll demonstrate his digging behavior here. Let me see if I can point this down at the ground. See if I can entice him to do it. Bring it back over here a little bit. There he goes.